And as the current president of the International Transpersonal Association, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Les Lancaster, who is the future president, or I guess president as of now, and my phasing out at the end of this meeting. Professor Lancaster is a very interesting gentleman because his research and scholarship goes across two very diverse areas. He is a neuroscientist who writes in the areas of hard science related to consciousness and other very traditional scientific and psychological fields. And he is also an expert in the esoteric area of Kabbalah. And combining both of those in some very creative and innovative ways. Professor Lancaster has been president of the British Psychological Sciences or Society's Transpersonal section. He is a professor of Transpersonal Psychology at Liverpool John Moores University. And with that, let me turn it over to Professor Lancaster.
Thank you, Harris. A last-minute addition to the program. And so I put this together rather hurriedly last night, but I hope you find it interesting. Harris mentioned that we are involved with some others in moving the ITA forward. And having taken that role, it focuses the mind somewhat. And I've had to think, what is my vision for transpersonal psychology, my particular aspect in psychology, and more generally, the ITA, the International Transpersonal Association. And there are answers that come to mind in my particular line of work. As an academic, it's of great concern to me that transpersonal psychology is still somewhat marginalized. And I certainly would like to see our discipline taking its rightful role in relation to other areas of my subject, psychology. But the vision is larger than that. And you know, if I could have any role, it might be with not wanting to sound too grandiose, but enabling the transpersonal to realize its destiny. And when I say it like that, I have in mind a conversation I was having last night in which we were talking about patterns in history. And I very much believe that an awareness of history and the historical patterns and forces that have shaped what we have now, that awareness is truly critical. In other words, it's very hard to look forward without, to some extent, looking backwards. And I see Bernard sitting here as well, and I have in mind the presentation you gave, with very much also understanding where we are now in relation to issues and forces of the past. One of the works that I think is very influential, I have a lot of agreement with, is the one by Rick Tarnas. Again, what shaped the Western mind. And I'm going to focus on a small part of that puzzle. I think it's an important part, but you may think it's narrow. And I would hope to show you that it's not as narrow as you might think. The title, I talk about the dynamic roots of transpersonal psychology. Using that term to emphasize that transpersonal psychology is so strongly bound up with the discovery, or maybe better, the rediscovery of the unconscious. Glenn Hartelius was talking the other day about the major phases of transpersonal psychology. One of these being the notion of beyond ego. Beyond ego, and another one, transformation. Immediately, we're in the terrain of understanding what it is we mean by the unconscious. And I always think that one of the unfortunate features in that history is the small prefix UN. And I don't mean United Nations, although maybe the connection is not lost. Because what we call the unconscious, by calling it with a negative, we're downplaying its crucially positive role. So the rediscovery of the unconscious brings us into the area of Freud and especially Jung in the context of the transpersonal. My presentation will make the point that this rediscovery and the pattern involved was prefigured in the early Renaissance. And there are good reasons for looking to that period in order to understand the times that we are living in. Both of these periods of time, the 13th, 14th centuries and 19th, 20th centuries, have been characterized by a rise in the significance of the feminine. In different ways, as I shall illustrate. And both of these particular times were also characterized by a peculiar relationship between Judaism and Christianity. I think everyone knows, for example, that Freud was Jewish and Jung was Christian. But what may be not so well recognized was the role of the discovery of Kabbalah, Jewish sources, the role that played in the early Renaissance. And the parallels at a general level are quite striking. The Renaissance is characterized, of course, by the discovery of other cultures. Islam bringing Greek ideas to Christian thinkers. And that's paralleled in our day with no doubt in our discovery of Eastern cultures. A crucial feature of the Renaissance was the exploratory mind, which was largely conditioned by geographic exploration. The great voyages of discovery, paralleled in our day by reaching out into space. And another crucial link for the Renaissance was the discovery of printing, which enabled communication of ideas. And of course that's paralleled in our day by the ITA revolution. Striking parallels. So before I go into the detail of what I want to say, I'll make a bit of a disclaimer. as I've said, it's the historical relationship between Judaism and Christianity which is particularly interesting here. And you might say that as transpersonalists, our vision is larger than that. So, for example, of course, we're very interested in Eastern traditions. I would answer to say that actually, when you do get to grips with the philosophical background of transpersonalism, it's Christian Europe you need to understand. And the other point I would make is that we often find people at these kind of conferences teaching about their particular spiritual tradition. That's not what I want to do, although I do know a lot about Kabbalah, and I'd be very interested to talk about that if people were interested. I'm not here to talk about the spiritual or mystical teachings. What I want to consider are the historical patterns. And with that, I'll move forward. All right. Well, I would, if it works. Is there any technical person here? Thank you. That, when I was praying, sitting there, thank you. There has been for 2,000 years a particular relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And it's a relationship of the shadow. And the encounters, and the encounter I would talk about in the early Renaissance, is very much to do with the encounter with the other. For the dominant culture in Europe, being the Christian culture, its encounter with Jews and Judaism was an encounter with the other. And the general point that will arise from what I'm looking at is not specifically these two particular religions, but the role of encountering, as I say, the other and the psychodynamic consequences of that. So, I know the time will go fairly fast and we're already late, so I'm going to move through this a little quickly. But to understand European culture, we go back to 2,000 years ago. The religious world revolved around Jerusalem and the temple that was there, and this was a place of sacrificial worship. 2,000 years ago, that was destroyed. And what arose from the ashes of that temple was a new age. And the tradition that had been present there bifurcated. It divided into two forms. One was the Judaism that lasted for the subsequent 2,000 years. We would call it Rabbinic Judaism. And the other was Christianity. And both dealt with the central idea of sacrifice. But it was no longer the way, it was no longer in the spirit of the age to sacrifice animals. What becomes Judaism takes the idea of sacrifice and looks at it in terms of the text. And the rabbinic tradition, it even is written that one has to sacrifice oneself by studying the text. The word becomes central. And there is a particular approach taken which involves the dynamic content of the sacred text. And most important for our purpose, this becomes an embodied tradition. The sacrificial altar is now understood as the table, at any table where you eat a meal, to do with transubstantiation of food, and as I say, it's a monistic tradition. The sacred being brought into the real world. And of course, the other tradition dealt with the idea of sacrifice in a very different way, and that's the notion of the divine sacrificing itself. And the antagonisms between these two traditions are fundamentally a conflict of worldview. In the terms that have been popularized in writings than transpersonal, one was an ascending tradition and the other is a descending tradition. One is a disembodied tradition and the other was an embodied tradition. It's changed today, but the roots of Christianity, I'll leave that quote, we'll come to this. The testimony of Paul in the New Testament. I won't read the whole, just at the end. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And this is essentially a polemic to separate itself from the other tradition, that which became Judaism. And that separation is, we understand, in the shadow relationship that I'm talking about. In fact, the early Christian theology labeled Judaism as Israel of the flesh, while itself, the church, it labeled as Israel of the spirit. So, in a very brief overview, there was an antagonism of two traditions. I don't have the time to talk about how that antagonism played out, but for any observer of European history, you will know that it played out in very bloody ways. The other piece of the background I want to talk about is the rise of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is a particular strand of Jewish mysticism, and it grew in the 12th and 13th centuries. There are two fundamental characteristics of this tradition. One concerns its understanding of the emanations from the divine. And it produced a symbol which we call the tree of life. Anyone who's encountered Kabbalah even slightly will know something of that. The other distinctive feature which arose in the 12th century and flowered in the 13th century is the one that's interesting here. And that was the idea of the divine feminine. Kabbalah developed. We'll move on. Okay. Unfortunately, it's not on the screen, so I have to see over my shoulder. The Kabbalah developed an idea around what in Hebrew is the Shekhinah. The word means the indwelling of God. It's a term that goes back to the early period, at least 2,000 years ago. But in the 12th and 13th century, it took on new connotations. And those connotations are summarized in this chart. there was a strongly erotic connotation. The central story or myth of the Kabbalah in the 13th century involved sexuality. Maybe the language that many of us here would be more familiar with would be the parallel with Tantrism, for example. The central idea was that within the divine itself, there were sexual polarities. And the human role in creation was to promote the union between these diverse, different polarities of God. And the language of, for example, the major work of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, which is published or circulated in the 13th century, is highly erotic. And each of the points I mentioned here, I could substantiate with many texts. But I shall simply read one extract. So I quote, "The desire of the female toward the male is aroused only when a spirit enters her and she produces fluid corresponding to the upper masculine waters. Similarly, the Shekhinah arouses desire in the Holy One only by the spirit of the righteous entering her. Then the fluids flow within her corresponding to the male, and all becomes one desire, one togetherness, one bond, a rapturous embracing of all." As I say, there is a great deal more that could be said about this emphasis on the feminine. But I want to make 2 points, 2 crucial points. Firstly, where did this come from? And secondly, where did it go? As far as where it came from, there was an increase in the presence of the feminine, which was within Christian Europe, especially France, especially the 12th century. The cult of Mary, the great cathedrals, Notre Dame, the troubadours, the ideal of love, the ideal of the quest, the knightly quest, the search for the Holy Grail. All these are the backdrop to these developments. It was the spirit of the age, and the way that spirit of the age played out in Judaism and Jewish mysticism, I've described. But I want to emphasize that there were 2 crucial points of distinction between the Jewish way and the Christian way as far as the feminine in the 12th, 13th centuries was concerned. Firstly, the Shekhinah is quintessentially divine. Mary was extra divine. In fact, it was a heresy at that time to think of Mary as divine. It's changed in the 20th century, but that's another story. The second point is the eroticism. Judaism is a this-worldly tradition, and it developed this eroticism. Christianity was ascetic. Again, the shadow relationship. Where did it go? I asked two questions. Where did it come from? Where did it go? Well, where it went, it certainly didn't go in the direction of liberating women. I have some quotes, but I think time is going to run away, so I'll just make this point. Christianity, Christian Europe in the 12th, 13th century was not a place where the female was liberated. And similarly with Judaism. The great ideas about the role of the female and relating to the Shekhinah, it was, as scholars of Kabbalah have put it, it was actually, it became a masculization of the feminine. Again, we need to leave all the detail to see the pattern. I'm running ahead of myself. The pattern is recapitulated in our day, and I hope and I think that the direction it takes is not to subjugate the female. So that's a background. Now, the Renaissance. First, a general pattern. When we're talking about these changes that I've been describing, then we have this upsurge in psychodynamic material, which in the times I'm talking about involve the feminine divine and the discovery of the unconscious. That brings about increased shadow activity. Hopefully there's a resolution. This is a pattern we see in individuals and we see in history. When with increased shadow activity, then it can go in a negative direction, a denial of the shadow, trying to annihilate the shadow. Hopefully it goes in a positive direction, where there's acceptance of the shadow. And if it goes negative, you just have a continuing cycle of that negativity. The positive direction, and we all know, being in the transpersonal, if you can handle the encounter with the shadow, it will bring growth, and at collective level, we see the development of new paradigms. This is what happened in the Renaissance. This is what's happening in our age. Probably the most crucial figure in the early Renaissance is Pico della Mirandola. And Tarnas credits him with the birth of the modern self. Pico is a fascinating character, not least because he incorporated translations of Kabbalistic works. The Kabbalistic translations had an enormous role in his declaration at the beginning of the Renaissance. The first quote is from his oration on the dignity of man. And again, I think time won't allow a full reading of it. There was a Rabbi Alemanno, who was a very important Kabbalist, who formed a relationship with Pico. Such relationships were very rare in the history of Christian Europe. And also there was a Jewish convert to Christianity who again translated. And so Pico is describing these Kabbalistic works, and he's making the point that these Kabbalistic ideas are bringing in the vital philosophical and mystical input for his thinking. The encounter with the other. Tarnas, and in a point that I totally agree with, shows that this melting pot in the 15th century gives birth to the self as we understand it in modern terms. The individual is self-defining. The individual is free. The individual is partner to the divine. All of these which are coming from the Kabbalistic input. Later, I shall talk further about that early period. But I now want to try to indicate that the discovery of the unconscious in the 19th, 20th century has a lot in common with the pattern I've just described. Again, it's too long a story to convey simply, but the crucial aspect of it is to realize that the tradition that Freud established, psychoanalysis, involves or includes seminally rabbinic or Jewish ideas. And again, I'm not going to read everything, but I think I'll read the second quote there, just to make that point. This author, Yerushalmi, has brought many, many sources, and he makes this point in an imagined dialogue with Freud. It's a very provocative way of conveying his ideas. I think that in your inmost heart, he's talking imaginatively to Freud, I think that in your inmost heart you believe that psychoanalysis is itself a further, if not final, metamorphosed extension of Judaism. Divested of its illusory religious forms, but retaining its essential monotheistic characteristics, at least as you understood and described them. In short, I think you believe that just as you are a godless Jew, psychoanalysis is a godless Judaism. And again, if I had 3 hours, I could substantiate that. But let's accept or reject. There are various reasons for saying that psychoanalysis draws on crucial ideas in Judaism. And this slide brings those parallels. We've already seen. Not just run through. So, in fact, I think it's easier. I'm sure you'll still be able to hear me. I'll talk loud if I draw it here. So, we've already seen the changes that happened 2,000 years ago. They're summarized here. Transcending animal sacrifice. Transcending the geographical specificity. It didn't have to be in one place. The rabbis developed a sacred hermeneutics, and this gave rise to what was known as an oral tradition. The parallels with psychoanalysis are striking. Freud, one of the quotes I had on the last slide, which I won't go into detail, Freud was convinced that his approach was not simply a therapy. He believed that he was bringing in a philosophical reorientation. And in suggesting that there are mental, unconscious processes, he was arguing against the dualism that was present and extant in European culture. And he had major arguments with William James and with Pierre Janet, to mention two at the time, who both argued that you couldn't have something which was mental but not conscious. That was the key philosophical debate at that time. It was a decisive new orientation, and that's a quote from Freud. these other points, the only one I'm going to really focus on was that he applied hermeneutics to the psyche. Just as the rabbis developed their own sacred hermeneutic, and again, I'm not going to bring this in detail because I think we all know the Freudian slip. Freud's approach to understanding the associationistic basis of mind. This is exactly what the rabbinic and Kabbalistic tradition did with the sacred text.
It has been translated hermeneutics as therapy. I'm just warning you.
Ah.
You may not understand.
Okay. Well,
I don't know whether you have to define it.
well, the therapy comes in as well, but we'll leave that. We'll leave that. Okay, let's bring those threads together again. We have, paralleling the Renaissance, the rise in the interest in the unconscious, which I'm identifying with the renewal of the feminine in that context. The other aspect that interests me, which is an aspect that is only now, in the last couple of years, really receiving the scholarly interest it deserves, is Jung's relation to the Kabbalah. And again, if you know some of the historical context, the early psychoanalytic circle was almost exclusively Jewish. And Freud was overjoyed to have a disciple being Christian, because he thought this would be the route where his ideas would come into the mainstream. It's much more subtle than that, actually. Because what Jung does is to transfer the emphasis on sexuality to an emphasis on spirituality. Now, Freud was fighting the dualistic worldview. The reason he held so tenaciously to his sexual view of the libido is because that was a clear statement of the embodiment of the psyche. The psyche, the unconscious, is bound up with the most embodied function we have. And you will understand the connections with the earlier eroticized material that I was talking about. But Jung makes the connections with the spiritual realm. And to that extent, Jung becomes the prophet of the transpersonal. But towards the end of his life, and this itself is a whole other story. This is bound up with his sadness over his own involvement with Nazism. But that's a whole other story. Towards the end of his life, he encountered more fully Kabbalistic material. And he had some visions, which he described as the most important visions that he had. And I described here. I'm not going to read it in detail, because again, time is a problem. But he had a vision in which he encountered the central images of the Kabbalah. For those who know something of Kabbalah, it's about the Sephirot and the sacred marriage, the eroticized image that I was talking about earlier. And again, towards the end of his life, he was interviewed. And by this time, he had conversations with scholars of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah. And he said, do you know who anticipated my entire psychology in the 18th century? The Hasidic Rabbi Ber from Mezrich, whom they called the Great Maggid. He was a most impressive man. Now, I want to repeat something I said before. I'm not here to extol a particular tradition. That's not my point. What the point is to look at the pattern. And what I'm saying, and again I'd have to spend more time justifying it fully, is that there was a parallel, the relationship between Freud and other Jewish scholars and Jung has an uncanny parallel with the relationship between, for example, Rabbi Alemanno and Pico della Mirandola in the early Renaissance. And now I can put it all together. I must say that there are many gaps in what I've been saying. Maybe you'll trust me that the gaps are filled in my own writings and understandings, but you can ask me questions. So the fundamental pattern I showed before, when there's an upsurge in psychodynamic material, it can give rise to increased shadow activity, and this may or may not lead to resolution and advancement. The two times we're looking at, the 12th to the 16th century, the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, the exaltation of the feminine, the cult of Mary, the role of the Shekhinah, as I described. 19th, 20th century, feminism, the discovery of the unconscious. Very tight parallels there. As we said before, there's a tension between the two cultures, in the sense that the Jewish culture eroticizes the feminine and the Christian culture de-eroticizes it. And then there's the reaction. And again, I remember something that you mentioned. You talked about witch hunting. It only started at this time. You made that point. The denigration of the female, which actually is connected with the rise of science, but that's another story, comes about at this time. And there are some very significant, in psychodynamic terms, reactions as far as the shadow between Christianity and Judaism are concerned. So at this time, at the same time as there's hunting of witches, there are some very strange accusations made against the Jews, which lead to thousands and thousands of deaths. Again, I don't have time to make the key points here, but these accusations all revolved around blood. So just for one example, the spring festival for Christianity is Easter. For Judaism is Passover. Passover is characterized by eating bread that has not risen. Yeah? Unleavened bread, matzah. Bread that has not risen. What's Easter all about? The risen. The shadow relationship was very clear. So an accusation came about at this time that the Jews were using the blood of Christian children to make their bread. It's just fantastical. But again, it led to thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths. The Jews are poisoning the wells. A well, psychodynamically, is the source of life. the blood is the source of life. Again, I haven't got time to go into all that, but those were the reactions. The resolution, and it was not a complete resolution, but the resolution comes with the Christian Kabbalah, what I was talking about. And it gives rise to the birth of the modern self. That's the pattern as it played out in the 12th to the 16th century. The pattern in our time has got so many parallels. So, again, the dialogue with Freud, which Freud is really the antidote to Descartes. Again, it'll take some time to explain. Descartes is the father of dualism in philosophical terms. Christianity is dualism in spiritual terms. Freud shifts our thinking into the thinking of monism. And today we are all conditioned in that way. There's no question about, in that sense, the Freudian Revolution. And the parallel to the shadow manifestations, the wars. There's not two wars, it's one war. And any historians of warfare will, I'm sure, agree with that. It's one war. But obviously the Nazism is the particular form. And all the accusations which were there between the shadow relationship of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, they're there in Nazism. I just mentioned one. In the 13th century, the Jews poisoned the wells. For Nazism, the Jews poisoned culture. So, and of course we know the consequences of that. But the parallel, that's why I was emphasizing the role between Freud and Jung and others, of course. The parallel in terms of the resolution, that there is a shift to a higher level, or not so much a higher level, a transition in the age. That's really the resolution. And of course Jung becomes in many ways the father of transpersonal psychology. We know that obviously transpersonal psychology was birthed in the 60s. But in real terms, the central figure for transpersonal psychology is Jung. Freud lies in the background of that. Sometimes a demonized figure, but that's again another story. So we see the pattern. We see the pattern, and if we know the pattern, we maybe can know the things we need to guard against and the areas that we need to promote. And that's what leads into, I think, to go back to where I started, that gives us a basis of a vision for the future. To know the past, you can watch for the warning signs, and you can build for the future. Thank you. So I know it's lunchtime, and people may want to go. If anyone wants to raise a question, that's fine. Yes?
In the middle one, in the increased shadow intensity, you have the denigration of women. Are you seeing a parallel between Freud's early acknowledgement of the sexual abuse of women and its connection with hysteria, and his subsequent shift into making it that women were just making this up?
Yeah. A very crucial question. These are issues of fashion. I mean, today we talk about recovered memory. What is really real? It's not a question that you can answer in the sense of what is, as it were, really real. The question is about what we believe to be real. Yeah? And there was a shift in what we believe to be real. And that is the essence of mythology. I'm answering maybe a little obliquely, but I think you'll understand what I mean. And, Jung becomes in many ways, obviously with Campbell later, but there's a connection, the master of myth. And transpersonal psychology is a psychology of myth. I think essentially it is a psychology of myth. I don't mean unreal. But the question of whether, I'm not going to buy in to the current hysteria. The current hysteria is that it's all to do with, sexual abuse. It's the pendulum swung. So, we're looking at these pendulum swings. That's the point of this presentation, really. Freud was at the point of the swing. So to start with, he saw it one way, and then he swung back. Maybe he was wrong.
The Kabbalah is the esoteric dimension of Judaism. Every religion has its esoterics. Now, the difference between, for example, in Christianity, you have the whole Benedictine, Cistercian, Templar story. In Hinduism, and Buddhism, it's Tantra. Now, the one exception that I found different about the Judaish one, and maybe I'm misreading it, is that esoteric is also masculine. There is a denigration of the feminine within the Kabbalah.
Yes, and that's I alluded to that. Well, I said it that we have, and again didn't have the time to go fully into it, but the rise of the feminine in the 12th, 13th century. A lot of people today look back at that and say it's like a golden age and there was worship of the female, and it's not true. That's rewriting history, and that's what I meant. That that trend did not see its full reconciliation.
We're talking. I'm sorry. I think. Let me repeat one.
Okay, go on.
I'm not saying that it was a manifestation. That was true in both Christianity and Judaism.
Okay.
That actually the idealism of the woman was not the liberation of the real woman.
Yes.
Okay, and the Shekinah did not liberate the woman in Judaic marriage. Right. So there we have a parallel.
Yes.
What I'm talking about, the esoteric content in Kabbalah denigrates the feminine. The duality is down. Okay? Even in the text, the Kabbalistic text you mentioned, the Zohar, the male is the big guy.
It's a male-oriented tradition, and the parent, right? And the religion itself is patriarchal, and the esoteric tradition within that is similarly male-oriented, and it's to some extent another discussion. But the challenge for us today, I sometimes think that as transpersonalists, we shy away from the reformulation of the traditions themselves. We sort of accept that the past was great and we need to refine that. The truth is that many of the traditions, even something like shamanism, which is flavor of the month, we are producing a neo-shamanism. We are producing a neo-Kabbalah. That's what I feel I'm involved in. And how you connect with the I think, very profound symbols of the Kabbalah and make them relevant to a feminine culture. That's the biggest challenge of all. But it's a challenge that I feel part of. And I think it's a challenge that we have to meet.
Yes. Please, since you are talking about this interaction between Christianity and Judaism, it's quite obvious that both topics are very significant for you. Mm-hmm. So for me it would be interesting to hear how these two spiritual movements and their interaction are reflected in your personal life, in your personal spiritual evolution.
Right. You asked. No, I'm not going to talk at length, okay? I mean, I am Jewish. I'm myself Jewish. I've been very involved with Judaism. I've studied in seminaries, and I have many friends of rabbis wearing big black hats. And that's the world I've been in. I spent a lot of time in Israel and Jerusalem and so on. I strongly believe that the division that I briefly referred to, that goes back 2,000 years, it's like a fault line, volcanic fault line that runs through the history of Europe. And I also believe that the Holocaust represents the end of that fault line. It's too much for me to explain fully, but I think it does. And so, for me personally, in fact, there's one word on that slide, Judeanity, right? I really strongly believe that for the future of certainly Europe and I think America, the Western mind in that sense, and maybe beyond that, I think the reconciliation of Judaism and Christianity is crucial. It was a necessary division, but the age of its necessity has come to an end. Question here.
First, I'm very pleased to see the field of transpersonal psychology grappling with the narrative of history and the identity issues that it brings up. That Jung writes a lot about that there are two conjunctions. There's a kind of a promise, where almost an engagement, and then there's a long period, and then there is the actual consummation, or the conjunction. And I've often wondered if the Renaissance is kind of that initial conjunction,
yes,
that a precursor to the sacred marriage in history,
yes,
and that time. And the symbol of Nazism, the swastika, is its symbolic meaning is the action of the origin upon the universe. Mm-hmm. And the manifestation of that symbol in the dynamic of culture is truly a very interesting phenomenon in terms of a Jungian reading of the symbolism of history, and the awakening or the pre-embodiment of the feminine and the encounter with the shadow. It just is a very, I'm intrigued by your
I think that there's again, you're opening up so many avenues. I mean, the fact that it was a Hindu symbol, I think, is very important as well in the context we're talking about. One of the, I said about Kabbalah, I said there are two key ideas, the feminine and then the tree of Sephirot life. Another crucial point is the esoteric teaching of recapitulation. So it's like, it's often said, as above, so below, okay? And Jung was really influenced by this, and it came through alchemy very strongly, for example. And I think that there is recapitulation in all things, and that's part of the pattern. So the fact that there's a sort of initiation in the Renaissance, and then it is recapitulated in our day. And exactly as you say, it's kind of that the recapitulation is not simply recapitulation, but it's taking from that initiation of the conjunction to we hope a fulfillment of that conjunction.
If we're wise.
Well, we live in hope.
I notice the conspicuous gap of not having the 17th, 18th century in the Enlightenment. Where do you see that in this dynamic of view?
Yeah, it's like I say, I can't include everything. I mean, where did the Mary cult come from? It came from an emphasis on patriarchy. I mean, it's a reaction against patriarchy, but also a sort of dry theology. It came as a reaction against that. Our age, it's a reaction against the arid philosophy, the Enlightenment and so on. The parallels are there, but I haven't really got time to go in it. But in asking the questions, I have no doubt that you see them. I think if anyone's rushing to go to lunch, don't feel you have to. You don't have to be polite.
I would like to see your attentiveness.
Как перевести мне?
Я попробовала помочь. Вы переводите, да?
Я подойду, я его последовательно переведу. Вот как вы смотрите на то, чтобы духовные традиции рассмотреть с точки зрения юнгианской типологии?
So, what do you think about looking at the spiritual traditions from the point of view of Jung typology? Introvertive, extrovertive.
И дальше вот эти вот
and 4 types: logical, sensoric.
Можно ли так рассматривать духовные традиции?
So, can we look at spiritual traditions the same way?
Yes, I think you can.
It's the first part of the question. And in addition to that,
что такое будет вот эта новая духовная традиция?
What will be this new spiritual tradition which integrates these previous traditions?
Okay, well, it's a very good question. I think that there are many typologies. Jung's is one. And you're quite right that different traditions emphasize different aspects of the psyche. I want to take it a slightly different way to connect with the historical dimension that I'm interested in. The reason why Christianity and Islam develop, just as the reason why Buddhism develops, is that the culture of the time was not fulfilling a basic type. And I would use a different typology, one that actually my teacher of Kabbalah taught, that essentially there are 3 types of motivation. One is motivation to light, one is motivation to dark, and one is motivation to communion. Judaism expresses the motivation to the dark. Now, I don't mean that it's sinister. Far from it. I'm Jewish myself. But if you study Judaism, you know that it goes into great complexity. I think it's no accident that rabbis wear dark clothes. The truth is in going deeper and deeper into darker and darker moments of the complexity. There had to be a reaction against that. Christianity is motivation to communion. But eventually comes Islam. And it's in its inception, and interestingly, very much in its philosophy, and its role in the early Renaissance, it was motivation to light. The situation in the modern world is very complex. But just as I want to look at the integration or the reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity on the basis of seeing the patterns in history, so I think we will only understand the way forward with Islam by understanding the patterns of history. I want to apologize to you because I twisted your question. I turned it in a direction that I wanted to make another point. But I did so with respecting your point that different traditions do draw or they represent differing aspects of the typology. And again, respecting the point I think you were making, that in moving forward, And maybe ultimately this is the real role of the transpersonal. In moving forward, we need to overcome the particularities of the traditions. I think we should eat. Thank you.